A React interview question you must know is the stopwatch. It should do the following. Display the current time and have 3 buttons. A start button, a pause button, and a reset button. Pressing the start button starts the timer. It then turns into the pause button. The pause button, as you guessed it, pauses the timer. Finally, pressing the reset button sets the timer back to 0. If the reset button is pressed while the timer is still running, it pauses the timer and then sets it back to 0. A last note before we jump into the code. We will be using React hooks to solve this question. And a lot of what you will learn in this video will be useful for other interview questions as well. You are watching The Helpful Coder, and let's get into the code. I have my editor open with an empty file. In it, we're going to import React and then create an empty component called Stopwatch. Then go ahead and export it. Next, update the component to return a div. Within the div, place a paragraph tag. This will later be used to display the time. After the paragraph tag, place 2 buttons. These will later be used to start, pause, and reset the stopwatch. We are now going to encounter our first hook, the useState hook. This hook lets us add state variables to our component. State variables are like our component's memory. They help our component remember and keep track of things. We are going to take advantage of this feature by using the hook to keep track of 2 things. The first is to keep track of the current time on the stopwatch. And the second is to keep track of whether the stopwatch is running or is paused. Let's go ahead and add these 2 state variables, after which I will break down their syntax. The first state variable has 3 key parts. The first is the variable time. This variable gives us the current time of the stopwatch. Next is the variable setTime, that is a function. Calling this function with a passed-in number will update our time state variable to that number. Finally, the 0, that is the starting value of our state variable. For our question, we want it to be 0 seconds. For our second state variable, isRunning will tell us if the stopwatch is running or is paused. setIsRunning is a function that will let us update the value of isRunning. And finally, we're going to start with an initial value of false. This means that at the start, our stopwatch is not running. It is now time for our next hook, the useRef hook. This hook, similar to the useEffect hook, lets us store values, but it has 2 key differences from the useState hook. The first is that it is used to store values, not used for rendering. Now what does that mean for our stopwatch? It means that the return section of a component will not use the stored value directly or indirectly. The second way that it differs from the useState hook is that updating the useRef variable does not cause a re-render. Let's compare the second difference to a time state variable. When we update time, our component will re-render to show the new value of time. This will not happen to our ref variable, and this is exactly what we want. We are going to use our useRef variable to pause and reset the stopwatch. I will go over how later in the video, but first let me break down the useRef syntax. It has 2 key parts. First is the variable name, and the second is the initial value, which in our case will be null. I have added some comments to our code to remind us of their use. Now let's use some of these variables and get a first look at what our stopwatch is looking like. Let's update our paragraph tag to display the current time by using our time state variable. Next, let's update our start and pause button. When the stopwatch is paused, we want the button to say start. And when the stopwatch is running, we want the button to say pause. The isRunning state variable will help with this. When it is true, the button should say pause, and when it is false, the button should say start. Finally, let's update the button to actually start and pause the stopwatch. We are going to use the isRunning and the setIsRunning state variables in combination with the onClick function of the button. The setIsRunning function will be called with the negation of the isRunning boolean value. Now, when the button is pressed, isRunning will be updated to the opposite boolean value of what it currently is. If isRunning is true, it will be updated to false, and if it is false, it will be updated to true. Let's look at our work so far. We can see our time, which is 0, and we have our start and reset buttons. Pressing our start button turns it to the pause button, and then pressing it again turns it back to the start button. Now on to our final hook, the useEffect hook. This hook consists of two parts, the setup and the dependency list. The setup is a function and is where the logic lives. The dependency list is an array of variables. Every time a variable in this array is updated to a different value, the setup function is called. One final note. Any state variable used within the setup function should also be on the dependency list. This ensures that we don't reference any stale data. For our stopwatch, we want our useEffect hook to run every time the stopwatch is started or paused. To do so, we will put the isRunning state variable in our dependency list. We want our useEffect hook to do three things. First, when isRunning is updated to true, we want to start the stopwatch. Second, when isRunning is updated to false, we want to pause the stopwatch. And finally, when the component unmounts, we also want to pause the stopwatch. Now, let's handle the logic to start the stopwatch. We will start by adding an if statement to ensure this logic only takes place when isRunning has been updated to true. To start incrementing the time, we are going to use the JavaScript function setInterval. setInterval has three key parts. The first is the function and the second is the delay. The function is executed every delay milliseconds. For our stopwatch, the delay is 100 milliseconds, which corresponds to 10 times a second. The third key part is its return value. It returns an interval ID. This is used to clear the interval. We will handle clearing the interval in our next step, but for now, we will store the interval ID in our ref variable. To assign a value to our ref variable, we will write a ref variable followed by .current. Now we have a function that runs 10 times a second, and we are going to use it to increment our state variable by 1. And to do that, we will use a setTime function. SetState functions also accept a function as a param. They use this to calculate the new state based on the previous value. First param of this passed-in function is going to be the previous state value, or in our case, the previous time. The function's return value will be the new state value. For our stopwatch, that is going to be previous time plus 1. Now, since this logic runs 10 times a second, after 1 second of running, the value of time will be 10. After 2 seconds, it will be 20, and after 2.5 seconds, it will be 25. Next, let's handle pausing the stopwatch. To do so, we want to clear the interval, or in other words, we want to stop updating our time. To clear the interval, we will use the clearInterval function, passing to it our interval ID. Remember, we are storing our interval ID in our ref variable intervalRef. Let's start by adding an else statement. This will handle logic for when isRunning is false. Within it, we will use an if statement to check if intervalRef.current exists. If it does, we will use a clearInterval function passing to it intervalRef.current. Now, to handle the component dismounting, we want to ensure that when this happens, the interval has been cleared. Let's add a return statement to the useEffect hook and to it pass a function. This function runs when the component dismounts. Within the function, we will put the same code we used to pause the stopwatch. Now when the component dismounts, the interval will be cleared. This helps avoid errors and memory leaks. Running our code, we now have a stopwatch that supports starting and pausing the time. The format of the time is incorrect, so let's quickly fix that. Going back into our code, within the paragraph tag, we're going to divide the time by 10. To this, we will use the toFixed function, passing it the number 1. This makes it so that the number displayed will have at most 1 decimal place. Looking back at our output, the time is now correctly displayed. We're getting close to the end now, and if you're finding this video helpful, you can help me by liking this video and subscribing. Now let's wrap up the reset button. The reset button should set the time to 0 and should pause the stopwatch if it is running. To do so, add a function called handleReset. Within it, use the setTime function to set the time to 0, and the setIsRunning function to set isRunning to false. Finally, update the onClick handler of the reset button to use the function we just created. We now have a functioning reset button. Before we jump into the next section, if you have any interview questions you want answered, please leave them in the comments below. Now I'm going to give a quick overview of how our different hooks interact with each other. Let's start from the beginning. Time is 0 and isRunning is false. The user presses the start button. This sets isRunning to true. Now remember, the isRunning state variable is in the dependency list of our useEffect hook. Since isRunning has changed from false to true, the code in our useEffect will run. It will go into our top level if statement as isRunning is true. setInterval will be called and the function within it will run 10 times a second. We will also store the interval ID in our ref variable. The function within the setInterval now constantly updates the time by 1, and for every update to time, a component is re-rendered, and the user can see the time increase on their output. Now the user presses the pause button. isRunning gets set to false, and because of this the useEffect hook runs again, but this time entering the top level else statement. Here the interval is cleared, and the function inside the setInterval stops running, thus no longer incrementing time. The stopwatch now appears paused. Finally, when the user presses the reset button, we set time to 0 and isRunning to false. If isRunning was true, or in other words, if the stopwatch was running, we will go into the useEffect hook and pause the stopwatch. If the stopwatch was already paused, it does not go into the useEffect hook as the value of isRunning never changed. At this point, you have a fully functioning stopwatch, good enough to impress your interviewers. But for bonus points, you can add some simple styling to differentiate your stopwatch from others. I will not be showing the CSS in this video, but you can find it and this React code in the description below. I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching and best of luck for your next interview.